Good day, everyone. I want to welcome everyone here that is logging in for today's webinar. My name is Frank Montero, and I am a partner here at the law firm of Fletcher, Heald and Hildreth. I want to welcome everyone to the next installment of Fletcher Heald's webinar series. And today's topic is going to be political broadcasting, a refresher course. We thought it would be a good time for us to tackle this topic with the political season now basically underway and getting going. Fletcher Heald, for those of you who don't know us, is a 90-year-old broadcasting firm. We've been working with the broadcasting community for nearly a century now. And we work with very many state broadcast associations, and many of those associations are represented here today on this webinar. We have, just to name a few, Colorado, Florida, Arkansas, Alaska, New Jersey, Mississippi, New Mexico, Puerto Rico. Kind of like the idea of having a webinar that spans from Puerto Rico to Alaska with very different climates and time zones there. I also want to do a shout out to Justin Sasso from the Colorado Broadcasters, who played an important role in helping to put this webinar together today. And just for anyone who is not a member of your state broadcast association, if you're a state broadcaster, they are a huge asset and have a wealth of information, do fantastic work for the broadcasting community. And so I strongly urge you to be a part of your state association and support them. I have with me today Seth Williams, one of my law partners here, who will be presenting. Sarah Hinkle, who was going to be presenting with me today, unfortunately is ill and not well. We also have with us, most importantly, are the representatives of the FCC's political programming staff, including Gary Schoenman and Seema Nielsen. Bobby Baker, who is going to be with us, may still be with us, is running a little bit late. He had an issue come up and sends his regrets. We're hoping that all is well and that he's going to be able to join us shortly. But regardless, we are very, very well represented in the hands of Gary and Seema here. Just a few housekeeping matters before we get going. First of all, this presentation today is going to be off the record. We have members of the FCC staff here, but as our disclaimer on the front page says, their opinions are their own and do not necessarily represent those of the agency or the federal government. Secondly, this webinar is going to be archived on YouTube, and we have a YouTube page, Fletcher Heald does, and so I invite all of you to go on to YouTube, search for Fletcher Heald and Hildreth, and you're going to find an entire library of past webinars to which this one will be added on a variety of topics, everything from maintaining your public file, license renewals, EEO, EAS, political broadcasting, and the list goes on and on. And then lastly, our blog, comlawblog.com, is also a resource for articles and information up to date on things that are going on at the FCC that affect the broadcasting community. You can subscribe free of charge, and we urge you to do so. Our presentation today is going to go on for roughly about an hour, maybe a little bit longer, but then we hope to leave some time at the end for questions and answers. If you have any questions, we're going to ask you to type those onto the Q&A section tab on your screen, and we will read those out loud, try to get to as many as we can, and then answer those. But we will have a hard stop after 90 minutes. So for East Coast time, that means we'll be ending at 1:30 East Coast time. So with no further ado, just kind of give a brief overview of some of the topics that we're going to be going through here today. We're going to be going through lowest unit rate calculation. Seth is going to be tackling that a little bit later on. That's an important part of this, which is how much you can charge political candidates that come to you wanting to buy political time. We're going to be talking about equal opportunities and what triggers those equal opportunities, and what programs are exempt from those equal opportunity obligations. We'll talk about issue ads from PACs, record keeping, which has become a very, very important issue, and then rule changes and many other topics of importance. But let's start with some very big, broad issues here, which is basically, what is a legally qualified candidate? What are we talking about here? Because it's basically, it's yours being approached by a legally qualified candidate or their committee or their campaign that initiates and triggers a lot of the obligations that broadcasters are subject to and have to comply with. So a legally qualified candidate is one that must have announced an intention to run. They have to be qualified under their state law to either hold office or to be on the ballot. They have to have displayed an intention to run and made a substantial showing of that intention. And that can include now social media presence, the creation of a campaign website, activities, electioneering, and the like. And then for presidential candidates, they have to be qualified in the state of the election or in 10 states. And if you have any questions or uncertainties about whether or not an individual is a legally qualified candidate, we suggest that you reach out to your state Secretary of State's office or with governmental officials to make a determination on that fact. I had sort of an instance come up years ago with a presidential candidate. Some of the gray hairs in the room may remember Lyndon LaRouche, who ran, and we were contacted by I was contacted by a broadcast station because the LaRouche campaign wanted to run a spot for the Virginia primary. Problem was, at the time, Lyndon LaRouche was literally behind bars. So the question became, could he be a legally qualified candidate while being behind bars? And it was really up to the state law, the Virginia state law. In that instance, at that time, he could not. So we informed the station that there was no obligation because he could not be a legally qualified candidate by being serving time behind prison at that time.
Frank, would that change, do you think, if he had been qualified in 10 other states other than Virginia?
If he was running, well, that's a really good question, Gary. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think it depends on if he's running for president, he has to be qualified in the individual state, and then he becomes recognized nationally if he qualifies as a legally qualified candidate in 10 states or 9 states in the District of Columbia. So it is possible to be qualified in one state, but not in another. And that does happen from time to time. I wanted to jump in a moment ago when you were talking about if stations have any questions that they should contact the state agencies, and that certainly is accurate. I want to add to that, though, that the burden to demonstrate that someone is a legally qualified candidate is on the individual who's claiming that. In other words, we get a lot of calls at the commission from stations who say, look, this guy is claiming he wants equal time, he wants to buy time. He's a lunatic. Just because he woke up one morning and decided he wanted to run for some office doesn't make him a legally qualified candidate. And if the station has a question as to whether an individual is a legally qualified candidate or not, the station has a right to ask the individual to demonstrate to their satisfaction, to the station's satisfaction, that they have met the requirements. So they can tell the individual, show us documentation that you're on the ballot, show us that you've made a substantial showing if you are claiming qualifications as a write-in candidate. Sometimes the individual will come back with information demonstrating that they are, but most of the time, if you have a crazy person, they'll just go away, and the issue is done.
Oh, no, I think that's a very, very good point. Thank you for raising that. I did happen to notice that somebody raised their hand while we're at this. We're gonna save some of the questions till the end, but if you have a question, please go ahead and type those into the Q&A or into the chat. We'll check both, and we'll get to those in a moment. The next issue that I want to talk about is what is a political use. Here's what it's talking about, because it's a political use in quotations. It's a sort of it's a magic term at the FCC. Is what triggers the equal opportunity obligations. If you're within the lowest unit rate windows, the lowest unit rate requirements, and the like. So it's doesn't necessarily have to be just a political ad. So what's a use? A use is a candidate's appearance for 4 or more seconds that in an identifiable voice or picture that portrays that candidate in a positive light. It doesn't have to be controlled by the candidate. I mean, the classic examples are the Ronald Reagan movies, or Donald Trump appearing on Saturday Night Live, or things of that nature, or even if this comes up with fair regularities. One of your employees, an on-air personality, a DJ, decides that they want to run for dog catcher in your town. Well, guess what? Now they're a candidate. Now every time they appear on your station, it's a use, which means that opposing candidates for that same election can request equal time and for equal pay, by the way. So because he's not paying for it, they would be able to have equal time for no charge. So just keep that in mind. So as I mentioned, the use does trigger the equal opportunity requirements for candidates. What's exempt from that? If you're doing a newscast and you happen to show a candidate, that's exempt. If you invite a candidate on to engage in an interview program, that's exempt. Or on-the-spot coverage, send a reporter down to cover a speech by a political candidate, that's exempt. We had sort of an interesting instance here that I know Seema and Gary will remember, that I always like to bring up, where you had a political candidate showing up on the Howard Stern show and was asked questions by Howard Stern, and they opposing candidates said, well, it's a use, it's the Howard Stern show after all, I want to have equal time. And the Stern show and others said no, that was a bona fide newscast, because he was in a news interview, because he was asking relevant questions, substantive questions. It went to the commission, and the commission agreed with Howard Stern and the stations that this was exempt, that it doesn't have to be Meet the Press or Face the Nation, and it can be the Howard Stern show. And if he's asking, if he's actually engaging in a bona fide interview of that candidate, then that qualifies as being exempt from a use. Now, what kind of access do you have to allow to political candidates to be on your station? Do you have any discretion on what time that you sell or don't sell to them? And that depends on the kind of candidate you're dealing with. If it's a federal candidate, your discretion to turn away that candidate is extremely limited. And basically by and large, you almost certainly within certain limits that I'm going to talk about in a moment, have to offer that federal candidate reasonable access to be able to purchase commercial time on your station. If it's a state or local candidate, you have discretion to be able to turn that candidate away and not offer them a time if you so desire.
You know, Frank, if I can jump in.
Yep.
It does come as a shock to many who are new to the political programming area that stations do not have to provide time upon request to a state or local candidate. And that the right of access, reasonable access, applies only to federal candidates.
Right.
And as you said, stations do have a lot of discretion as to how they want to handle state and local requests for advertising. They can choose between different races. In other words, they can say, well, we're only going to carry ads for candidates running for mayor, but not for governor, or vice versa.
Yeah.
Or we're going to carry ads for mayor for only 3 weeks, and that's it. We're not going to sell any more time beyond 3 weeks.
Right.
The important thing to note with regard to state and local advertising is that if a station does decide to sell time to a state or local candidate, and it doesn't have to, but if it does decide to do so, then it has to afford equal opportunities upon request to all opposing candidates for that same state or local office.
That's exactly right. It's what we lawyers call it opens the door, right?
Yes.
It opens the door to that, and once you've opened that door, you have to offer that equal time to the opposing candidate within that election. But you don't have to open the door if you don't want to for the state candidate. So,
right. And
I will say that. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Seema.
No, I was just going to say, Judge, a good thing for stations to keep in mind is if they are in an area with a lot of races, particularly, they have federal plus a lot of local and state, happening in that year, it's a good idea to kind of think through your strategy ahead of time. We're only going to have enough space if we need to make sure we can accommodate the federal candidate requests. We really only have time to do maybe one local or state.
So with federal candidates, that are entitled to reasonable access, when does this kick in? So it applies to candidate uses. We now know what a use is during the entire campaign period. Stations cannot set limits or just flat out, limits for federal candidates on the amount or the type of spots that they may want to purchase. However, the stations can reject unreasonable requests and negotiate with those federal candidates for that. So what is that? What is reasonable or unreasonable? You have to offer time on prime program time. However, you can exclude the news from that offering. However, you are not allowed to exclude any other category other than news of programs from that availability to the federal candidate. They do not have a right of access to any particular program or day part. And for non-commercial stations and the educational stations on reserved channels, just remember that they are exempt from this reasonable access requirement.
Frank, if I can jump in, when it comes to access for federal candidates, the important thing that stations should keep in mind is that the term is reasonable access. In other words, stations don't have to turn over their entire programming day to candidates, to federal candidates. If a federal candidate approached the station and said, look, I want to buy, 3 hours or 4 hours worth of time 2 days before the actual election, that could be considered excessive.
Right.
And the station would say, well, that's an unreasonable request. Stations can negotiate with the federal candidates and try to come to some agreement on what they want to sell, what the candidate, the federal candidate, is entitled to, and what the station is required to sell to them. And that's a negotiation. But
Right.
stations don't have to turn over their entire broadcast day to federal candidates.
That's
It's
an
only-
excellent point. And in fact, so just kind of some of the criteria of things that you've just mentioned here, Gary, on, what, would be a valid criteria for a station to take advantage is, as you pointed out, how much time was previously sold? Are they like hoarding up all of your available time so that none is available? And, is it going to be disruptive to the programming, especially bearing in mind that you are now going to have to offer equal opportunity requests? If you have an election that has, God knows what, 10 different candidates, and all 10 of them may come to you, you have to weigh that. And your point, to your point, Gary, the timing of the request. I mean, if they're coming last minute, right, and, the eve of the election, they want to buy up your, all your inventory, and that you don't have that available, I would think, right, Gary and Seema, would be sort of legitimate grounds, criteria to be able to, limit the amount that's available to that candidate.
Yeah.
Bearing in mind that they may have, equal time requests.
We have
and it's
said
and
in the past, sorry. Gary and I just get so excited. We've said in the past that a candidate can't sit on their rights.
Right.
So waiting until the last minute and then saying, all right, I want, 20 spots that are equivalent to what my opponent got, that's probably not a reasonable thing to do. So
That's a great way of putting it, sitting on your rights. You can't just sort of hoard on it and sit on it and then use it when you like. I think that's a good way of putting it. Absolutely.
and it's
Also,
not just
okay, go ahead, Gary.
I was going to say, it's not only equal opportunities, the number of competing candidates who you might get equal opportunity requests from that goes into the mix, but it's also the number of elections that are in your coverage area. I guess a good example would be if you were a New York City station, you may be serving Connecticut and New Jersey and New York and upstate New York, and you might cover many federal districts where you have a lot of elections going on and you have a lot of competing candidates going on. All this goes into the mix as to how much time, what is a reasonable request, and how does a station evaluate what's reasonable and what they have to sell to a federal candidate, and when they can tell a candidate, no, your request is unreasonable, let's try to negotiate this.
Gary, if I could jump in, I mean, that is necessarily sort of a case-by-case analysis, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Each situation is going to be different for each station, and each election is going to be different. For example, an election for one district may have 5 competing candidates. So if candidate number 1 comes in and asks to buy time, and the station has to say, well, there are 4 other competing candidates who might ask for equal opportunities. I would have to sell time to all of them upon request if I grant you, candidate number 1, your request to buy time. And so it depends on how many competing candidates there are, how many requests for equal opportunities the station might receive. And of course, the timing goes into it. How close to the election, things like that. How much time has that first candidate bought already?
Right.
If they've already bought hours and hours of time and they want to buy even more, if they have deep pockets, that goes into the mix as to how a station determines whether the request is reasonable or not.
And I think that raises 2 quick points for me. I mean, first, it highlights what Seema said earlier about thinking about your election coverage before you get into the immediate run up to the election. So if you have a number of federal elections and also a large number of state elections, give some thought to those state elections and where you want the priority to be, because you do have discretion with those where you don't for the federal. And also, if you get into a situation where you're thinking about denying political advertising time on a reasonableness basis, reach out to your FCC counsel, because like Gary said, it is a case by case situation. There's no hard and fast rule that says if somebody comes to you, 24 or 48 hours before the election, you can deny their request. That's not the case. So it's always a fact intensive situation.
So let me just jump back in here, and up until now, we've largely been speaking about how to deal with the federal candidate. But as I mentioned at the outset here, the rules dealing with state and local candidates are different. With state and local candidates, we mentioned earlier, the station has a lot more flexibility and discretion as to how they can handle it, or whether they will sell any time to that candidate at all. The stations can take political ads from one race, but not in another. They can limit the number of ads or programs that the state or local candidate is seeking, or restrict it to day parts. However, the stations do have to make all discount classes available. They can't, discriminate in that respect. And as was mentioned earlier, once you open that door to the state or local candidate, you have to make equal time available to opposing candidates for the same election. If you're within the lowest unit rate windows, which Seth is going to speak about in a moment, you have to make the lowest unit charge available, and you cannot censor the ads. That's something that should talk about here, is that, with regard to these ads, both federal and state and local ads, the station cannot censor, edit, or tamper with the content of those ads. They are limited. The station has certain protections with regard to liabilities, libel, slander, that sort of thing. But even if the candidate happens to be, taking a position or political platform, or advocating a stance that you disagree with, that you are not allowed to tamper with the content of that ad once you have opened the door to that candidate for state and local ads, or with any federal candidates that have reasonable access onto your station.
Frank, somebody asked whether or not, I thought it might be a good idea to.
No, yeah, go ahead.
Somebody asked whether or not the station needs to proactively reach out to opponents if they do open the door.
Right.
No, that's not required. Only if they're approached do they.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. And that so with equal opportunities here, it applies when the candidate is legally qualified. As we mentioned earlier, if they're not legally qualified, then there's no equal opportunities, obligations on your part. It applies to other candidates in the same race. So, one political party cannot claim equal opportunities against another political party for a completely different race. That doesn't work. It has to be sort of apples to apples, oranges to oranges within the same race. And then, as you pointed out, Seema, correctly, that the candidate has to come to you and has to request the equal opportunity within 7 days of the opponent's use. So they have a shot clock, if you will, by which they have to make that request. And again, this is triggered by non-exempt uses. If it's exempt, if it's a bona fide interview or newscast or the like, then the equal opportunity requirements are not triggered. So now I'm going to turn it over to Seth, who is going to walk us through the thorny issue of what you can charge these political candidates and what's called the lowest unit charge. So Seth?
Yes,
Frank,
go ahead, Gary.
Frank, if you don't mind, just on the subject of equal opportunities, I know you had mentioned, it has to be the same race, apples to apples, oranges to oranges, and just as a practical matter, just to give you an example, in the primary season, for example, Republicans are running against Republicans, Democrats against Democrats. So, for example, if Trump right now were to buy time on a station, Biden would have no entitlement to ask for equal opportunities because technically they are not running against each other yet.
Yes,
Okay.
right, yeah, good point, very good point.
And so that makes a big difference. We do get questions every so often during the primary season about cross party requests for equal opportunities, and they don't apply during the primary season.
The primaries is what, no, good, very, excellent, thank you for that clarification, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you, Gary. And as we move to lowest unit charge, this is sort of where the rubber meets the road. Obviously, election season can be a big infusion of advertising dollars for the broadcasting industry. But as I think everybody on this webinar understands, you're obligated to provide the lowest unit charge for those advertising dollars under the circumstances that we'll discuss here. And so the first thing to keep in mind is that it applies to all political races, federal, state, and local. So again, keep in mind, if you open the door to state and local, then you're opening the door to the lowest unit charge for those races. It also applies only during the window that is 45 days before the primary or the caucus, or 60 days before the general election. So compare this with the equal opportunity and the reasonable access rights, which are tied to when a candidate becomes legally qualified. And so those are much more expansive rights in terms of the time that campaigns have them to access your stations. With the lowest unit charge, which is only applicable during these windows ahead of the primary, caucus, or the general election. The window is, reasonably substantial, 60 days, so about 2 months or 45 days. But outside of those windows, you're not obligated to give political advertisers lowest unit charge.
And then just jumping in there, just, as mentioned, we're officially in the primary season here now. We have a lot of states represented on this webinar. As I mentioned at the outset, we go from Puerto Rico, Florida, all the way to Alaska. And so you will have to determine, when the primary schedule for your state is, and be able to, calculate that on 45 days back to make that information available to your members in your state.
And if you have multiple jurisdictions in your coverage area, you'll have to calculate that into the factor as well, because at least with the general election, for federal elections, we're all on the same day, but the primaries or caucuses may be on different days. And so if you straddle multiple jurisdictions, you may have multiple lowest unit charge windows that apply during your political seasons. And then the last point on there is that the use must be in connection with the campaign.
Sorry.
So this is sort of the definition of what a lowest unit charge is. And as you can see here, there are 3 sort of highlights that I want to pull out for everyone. That the lowest unit rate is charged for the same class of time, the same amount of time, and the same period of time. And so there are, for most stations, there will be multiple lowest unit charge calculations that need to be done within the LUC window. So in terms of the same class, that would be fixed or preemptible. In terms of the same amount of time, you've got a 30-second spots, 60-second spots. In radio, you might even have a 15-second spot period of time or amount of time, excuse me, and then the same period of time, prime time, drive time, middle of the day, depending on how you break up your broadcast schedule. So within those 3 sort of broad groupings, you may have multiple different types of lowest unit charges that you can offer to campaigns and political advertisers when they approach you. So inside the political window, LUR is essentially a most favored nation status that is enforced on your interactions with political advertisers. So I suspect anybody who's familiar with contracting might be familiar with what a most favored nations clause is. It is essentially a clause that says whatever you give to the best similarly situated type of person in your contractual or commercial negotiations, you'll also give those same terms to me. And just generally, they could apply to any number of terms. But in the context of the lowest unit rate, they are in terms of the consideration that you're able to charge for political advertising. So the thing to keep in mind with lowest unit charge is that it is essentially a mandated most favored nation status for political advertisers in the context of the LUC window, 45 days before primaries and 60 days before the general election. So for different types of plans, there are different types of calculations that go into that. We discussed that on the prior slide based on the class, amount of time, or the period of the day. But for package plans, that is not a separate class for lowest unit charge. Package plans are essentially just a volume discount that you're extending to the advertisers. So allocation for packages among various classes or periods is permitted. So again, you can go back to the slide and think about prime time, drive time as different periods in the day, different amounts of time for the advertising spot. All of that might be built into your package, but the package discount itself is not a separate class for LUC considerations.
So you have to sort of, unpackage, if you will, the package plan, right, and into its elemental parts, which is important because a package plan can dramatically affect your lowest unit rate for the subdivided section of that package.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Frank. I mean, so if you're offering a package plan, then when you bring that spot back into the class of time that you're doing the lowest unit calculation for, you then have to offer that same lowest unit rate for anybody else, any other political advertisers, anyone entitled to lowest unit charge in those same classes. So it can very much impact the lowest unit charge. And if you did happen to have multi-year contracts, you would calculate lowest unit rate for multi-year contracts similarly to package rate plans. And so again, that could impact your lowest unit rate calculation across each of your classes of time. So for preemptible time, if you sell preemptible time, you can define, again, reasonable classes of time, each with their own lowest unit rate calculation. So for example, you could have immediately preemptible time and preemptible time with notice. So each of those may be treated as a separate level for lowest unit rate calculations. That's different from package rates. So those do constitute separate classes. Stations must disclose the approximate likelihood of preemption in each class. And stations that sell time on a perpetual auction basis only have one class of preemptible time. There may be other classes that you could generate in that situation, but in terms of preemptible time, you would only have a single preemptible category. Also, with respect to preemptible time, you have to have a reasonable class of time, and it can't be solely related to your ability to charge money for the preemptible class. So some of the reasonable benefits that you might be able to articulate for having preemptible time might include the level of preemption protection that you get within that class, scheduling flexibility on your part, or the ability to provide make good time, all might be different reasonable reasons for having preemptible classes, but it cannot simply be to facilitate additional revenue generation on the part of the station. So we're going to move through the next few slides pretty quickly, but this is just what to include in the lowest unit rate charge. And we'll move on, Frank, to really sort of the more interesting part, which is what to exclude from the lowest unit rate charge. You see here spots with no payment, barter spots, per inquiry spots. That's if you have a spot that is based on engagement. So if you charge based on the number of responses to the advertisement, that would not be included in lowest unit charge calculations. Bonus spots for charitable organizations also not charged. With barter and other non-cash or merchandise related charges, I do want to highlight that if you make that available to one candidate within a race, you then again have opened the door to offering that to other candidates in that same race. The only exception there would be if it's of de minimis value, or if doing so would imply some sort of endorsement on the part of the station for the candidate. This is a little bit further discussion on what to exclude. That point at the top of the slide there talks about de minimis, non-cash merchandising rates that we just discussed. For web services, generally, if you're providing web advertising, that's not covered by the FCC's political broadcasting rules. Right. And those should be excluded from lowest unit rate charges. But I'll highlight in that bullet point that if you have web advertising that is part of a package that candidates are getting on the broadcast side, then if you offer it to one candidate, you've opened the door to offering it to other candidates. So if as part of your package you say, we'll give you so many spots on air, plus we'll give you a banner ad on our website, then the same offer has to be made available to candidates in the same race.
And it's worth just mentioning with web services generally, if you have a candidate that is purchasing time just on your website, as Seth mentioned, a lot of what we're talking about here does not necessarily apply. Your discretion to turn down that advertising, even if it's a federal candidate, very different with web services because the FCC's rules here don't apply. Your ability to edit that program or deny that or censor that, again, much broader. You are also more open to liability. You don't have the liability protection that you have for on-air advertisements. So, but where you also need to be very difficult is if you bundle the two and you package the two. Just to remember, because if you are selling, ads on both, if you're on the air and on your website, that these rules do apply to those on air, and you just have to be careful how that is all going to affect your exposure as well as the lowest unit rate charges.
And then we'll move on to the next slide, I think. On make goods can be a little bit of a tricky area for political advertising and lowest unit charge calculations. If the make good spots that you offer to a campaign end up lowering the comparable LUC, then you have to make that comparable rate available to other similarly situated, again, advertisers. So if you've offered make goods that lower the LUC, you may end up having to provide a rebate not only to that campaign, but also to other campaigns that are impacted by the lower LUC rate. And certainly we know that is never something that that broadcasters are enthusiastic about.
Right.
It's always tough to have to give back that money, but if you do give the rebate to one candidate, then the reduction in the LUC applies across that class of time. So for example, if there's an audience shortfall made good, information might not be available for that during the election period. You have to disclose the possibility of that ahead of time. And you may have to give the rebate after the election concludes. One option here is to negotiate make goods for a subsequent election. So you can offer make goods for a subsequent election. And the make good must run before the election if the station has provided time-sensitive make goods to any commercial advertiser purchasing the same class of time during the year preceding. So two things to pull out of that bullet point. The trigger there is any commercial advertiser purchasing the same class of time. It's not limited to political campaigns, and it is again bracketed there by what class of time you're selling. And then the final thing to pull out of that is that the trigger period is the preceding year. So it's not within the LUC window, it's not within the campaign window, it's whether you've made time-sensitive make goods to any commercial advertiser of the same class during the preceding year. And then I think this is our last slide on LUC, but in any case, advance payments and credits, you are entitled to ask for advance payment from campaigns. We get that question with some regularity. I think there are campaigns that lean on stations to not require prepayment or to only deal with post payment, and that can be a difficulty with campaigns that will certainly exist up until the election and then very quickly cease to exist thereafter, especially if the candidate does not win. So for federal candidates, you can require payment 7 days in advance, no more than 7 days in advance. For state and local races, your commercial advertising payment policy would apply. So whatever you offer to your general advertisers commercially is the same policy that you can put in place for state and local races. And credit must be offered if a candidate has established a credit relationship with the station, if the candidate assumes responsibility for payment, and if the station would give credit to a similarly situated commercial advertiser. So again, the trigger here is commercial advertisers, not necessarily just other candidates, although once you've opened the door for this with campaigns, you need to have a similar policy across your stations. So now
on lowest unit charge, I guess one big observation is lowest unit charge applies only to candidate-sponsored ads. It does not apply to issue advertisements.
Correct.
Issue advertisers, stations can charge whatever the market will bear.
Yeah, thank you, Gary. That's a great point. And in some respects, it's a good transition to BICRA. So I suspect most of us know what BICRA is. It's sort of the federal law that requires candidates to accept responsibility for for the advertising that they put on the air under certain circumstances. It applies both to legally qualified candidates, and here it applies outside of the campaign to national legislative issues of public importance. So BICRA can be outside of the LUC window. That's important to keep in mind. So the record keeping requirements and some of the other requirements in BICRA apply outside of the LUC window. But when we're inside the LUC window, if a federal candidate wants to receive the benefit of the LUC, they must comply with the BICRA certification. This requirement's for federal candidates only. And we would say there may be state requirements that apply to state races. You should consult your FCC counsel and your state laws regarding that, but BICRA applies at the federal level. It initially amended the federal statute, section 315, but we would note last year, I guess 2 years ago, 2022, right? The FCC added the BICRA requirements into its rules in the Code of Federal Regulations. So from a practical standpoint, there's probably not much of a change there in terms of your compliance. The statute always governed your compliance, but those rules are now mirrored in the FCC's rules as well. The last thing I'll add on this slide is that franking ads, which we also get questions on from time to time, are covered by BICRA, but franking ads would not be covered as part of a lowest unit rate calculation. So again, Gary talked about that distinction, and so I would add that as something that is not tied directly to a campaign. That is when a sitting member comes to you and says, we have funds from the government to run advertising that promotes maybe some local program that has funding through the federal government or some other thing that the member wants to notify the public on. The FCC has said that those are BICRA covered ads. So again, the compliance with BICRA applies to those types of advertising, but they would not be subject to the lowest unit charge. Can we skip a slide? Yeah, there we go.
Okay.
So this is sort of where this is sort of the nuts and bolts of what BICRA ad sponsors for ID requirements for federal candidates. You see there that for TV, the image of the candidate identifying him or herself and stating he or she has authorized the ad. By this time, I think most of us are fairly familiar with that type of I'm Seth Williams and I approve this message at the end of the advertisement.
Stand by your ad.
Yeah, to stand by your ad. I would point out a couple things for TV. Any text at the end of the advertisement does have to have sufficient contrast. Again, this is sort of a reasonableness standard that would be applied here. So if they're trying to put, white on white or white on gray to really kind of obscure the text that they're having to add, that is not permissible. But it would be to your reasonable judgment whether or not a viewer could discern the text that's required and make a judgment about that on your part. And then the final BICRA advertisement, or excuse me, BICRA slide that we have discusses political programming advocating for elections or defeat of a federal candidate. If it is authorized by the campaign, it must explicitly say so in identifying the paying party. If it's not authorized, you still must identify the paying party. So there, if it's a third party advertiser, and that has certainly grown in recent years, they may not have to identify the campaign, but would still need to identify the paying party.
All right. Well,
Seth, if I can add about the BICRA ID requirements at the end, just stations should keep in mind that the requirements, the stand by your ad requirements, I'm John Doe and I approve this message, that applies only to federal candidates. Now, a lot of state and local candidates will use that language because they feel it makes their ad sound more legit.
Right.
There's no requirement for them under federal law, but there's nothing to stop them from using it if they want to say that.
Right. Now, if they don't with the federal ad and they don't, they refuse or just don't put that tag on, then that can dispense with lowest unit rate, correct?
It can. Most federal candidates will put that language in. I mean, they know better. And, I wanted to mention one thing about that certification. We get very few complaints about that. Federal candidates know they have to do the certification and they provide it routinely. We get very few inquiries about that.
But the converse is also true, which is that if it's a state ad and the candidate does not add it on because he's not required, you still have to charge him those, right?
Yes. Now keep in mind, all candidate ads have to have a sponsorship ID.
Right. Oh, well, yeah.
And that goes without saying. You know, we're not talking about that here. Sponsorship ID is required in all issue ads as well as candidate ads.
All ads, period, right? I mean, just, certain things, yeah.
Yes, all
Right.
political ads, issue ads and candidate ads have to have an explicit sponsorship ID, either at the beginning or the end if it's 5 minutes or under,
Right.
or at the beginning and end if the message is more than 5 minutes in duration. And interestingly, the requirement to put in a sponsorship ID is the one exception to the no censorship rule.
Right.
As Frank and Seth said earlier, stations cannot censor candidate-sponsored ads. That is an absolute. However, well, not necessarily an absolute, because there is that one exception. If the ad lacks an appropriate FCC required sponsorship ID tag, the obligation is on the station to ensure that ad contains the tag. So the station can add the tag if it doesn't have one.
Right.
That is the only exception to the no censorship requirement.
Because our requirements govern the stations, whereas the stand by your ad requirement is directed towards the candidates and what they must do.
Oh, it's a good point. That's a good, subtle, but good point. Good. Thank you. Steve, for that. Okay, well, we are on the home stretch here, and then we're going to open it up to questions and answer. We have a couple of remaining topics, and certainly not unimportant ones. So let's just briefly touch on the political file requirements. Now, before I jump into this, let me just say that the FCC's political file requirements could be its own webinar in itself, and in fact, it is. We have on our YouTube page, we have a webinar that is devoted entirely just to maintain the political file. So I invite you to look at that. And the political file obligations are one that I believe the FCC has been really keen to reinforce in recent years, both in terms of fines that have been issued during the renewal cycle, the license renewal cycle that we just came out of a couple of years ago. There were, quite a few admonishments and consent decrees that came out of that. Stations were subject to compliance reporting requirements as a result of shortfalls in their political file compliance. So this is something that is not to be taken lightly. Go ahead.
And Frank, the transition to an online public inspection file, I think, has also been a big driver here.
Absolutely.
Before, you could kind of, who was going to come into the station and look at the public inspection file from the public. Even, FCC staff were not routinely in all of the tens of thousands of TV and radio stations across the country. But now it's online. Anybody can look at it at any time. That's FCC staff, it's
Right.
members of the public. So it is now much more available than it was 10 or 20 years ago.
That's absolutely correct. Yeah. So you want to keep records of all non-exempt uses. And I'll go into more detail of what constitutes the information that's been kept there. Information that's going to go into your the political file of your public file is going to be kept for 2 years. Again, precisely as was mentioned, we are now for both radio and television, very much well into an online public file regime. So this is certainly one where if you have a compliance officer at your station that's keeping track of things like, say, quarterly issues programs lists and, EEO filings and whatever else is required there, you should certainly have them on their toes regarding political file compliance now that we are, well into a political season. And maintaining a backup file is one that should be done as well for this information. The information that has to be kept here is, when you are approached, the name of the candidate requesting time, details of who or the entity that placed the order, the name, the telephone address, etc., the basic information of the candidate and the campaign that contacted you, as well as the disposition of the request, schedule that was provided, the class of time, the rate, and when it was aired. Now, important here is that you put this information into your political file, even if the candidate ultimately changes their mind and decides not to purchase the time. And obviously, in that instance, you would not include when aired because it wasn't aired. But it's not just for ads that are actually aired on the station. So just keep that in mind that you have to put that in there. A lot of the state broadcast associations that are out there, as well as the National Association of Broadcasters, as well as, I would be remiss to say, our firm, many law firms out there have forms that you can use. The NAB has a very well, published and used their PB form, political broadcasting form. So, these forms make it easier for your compliance person, so that because it actually has sort of the blanks there, what information you need, so that they can just basically fill in the blanks and then upload that information into the public file. But just just remember to keep all that in there.
Yeah, Frank, I would echo what Frank said. I mean, we do get from time to time questions about whether or not use of the NAB form or similar forms are required. It's not required. So you don't have to use the NAB form or your state broadcasting form, but it's an excellent resource because, as Frank said, it pulls all of the requirements into a common place for you, or at least many of the requirements into a common place for you, and it makes it a routine that you get into when uploading these things to the public to the political file.
Right.
And that's a very good point. That the FCC doesn't require any particular kind of form.
That's right.
But the forms that are out there, like the NAB PB 19 or 18, whatever number they are on now, that's a convenience.
Right.
And if you fill that out properly, you will be providing all the information that the FCC requires. I just wanted to mention one thing about the timing of putting the information in, and I don't mean how fast you do it, but the kind of request that comes in. A lot of stations will get a request from a candidate saying, if I were to ask to buy time, I mean, how much would you charge me for this or that? And they're making a broad general inquiry, kind of fishing around, trying to see what the landscape looks like in terms of prices. That's not a request for the purchase of time that a station has to upload information about.
Right.
What the station does have to upload is information, we call it records. They have to upload a record about a firm request for the purchase of time. And that's a request that the station is capable of accepting or rejecting. But a fishing expedition, a request that constitutes a fishing expedition, you do not have to upload information about that. That is not considered a firm request for the purchase.
And Gary, as long as you open the door, there is a deadline by which this information has to be put into your political file, and that is
within one business day.
Right.
That the firm request for the purchase of time comes in.
Right, and that's important because remember that with the online public file now, information is stamped, time stamped when it's uploaded to that public file. So this is, this is a short deadline. People sometimes will confuse this with the 7 days that opposition candidates have to ask for equal time. There is no 7-day requirement here. This is a 1 business day requirement. This is a short fuse that you have to get this stuff in there uploaded.
And that's a good point that you raised, Frank, about equal opportunities. The question with equal opportunities is, how does the opposing candidate know what the first candidate has purchased? Well, they can listen to the station 24/7 and say, oh, I heard my opponent on the air. I'm going to go to the station and ask for equal opportunities. That's pretty inefficient to have to listen to the station all day to find out what your opponent is doing. The more efficient way is to go to the online political file and see what your opponent has purchased or is preparing to purchase.
Right.
And that's why it is vitally important that stations upload information about requests within 1 business day, because it is through that vehicle of putting it online, it alerts the opposing candidate what the candidate is buying. And so if a station does not upload within 1 business day, they are essentially delaying that 7-day clock for the opposing candidate to request equal opportunities.
Gary, when you say delaying that clock, the commission has not made a decision or has not addressed whether or not it would in fact delay that clock. You're just saying it's making it, the point of the rule is that uploading within 1 business day allows the opposing candidate to make use of that 7-day window. And by failing to do that, a station essentially shorts the candidate an ability to respond during that 7-day window. Not that it does in fact move back the window. Is that correct?
Well, we have said informally that it could support an argument, a legitimate argument, that the opposing candidate was denied the opportunity to request equal opportunities because the information about the initial request was not uploaded in a timely manner. We have not come out with a formal order to that effect, but I think it's fair to say that an argument could be made to that effect, and that if the commission were to issue an order, that would become the law of that particular case.
Suffice it to say, the prudent course of action is just stick to the 24 hours of the 1 business day if you can.
Don't let your station be the test case.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And it's 1 business day, not 24 hours, because if a request comes in on a Friday, you don't have to upload it on Saturday. You don't have to rush back to the office and upload it. You can upload it by close of business on Monday.
Right.
So it's 1 business day.
Thank you. And so we're just going to sort of close up here on a couple of real quick points, just touching on issue ads here. Again, a requirement of the political file, albeit this is not a candidate campaign ad, but you are nonetheless, when approached, have to upload a list of the officers and directors of a sponsor who is requesting to put on your station programming that will communicate a political matter of national importance, and that includes programming which it may discuss legally qualified candidates or any election to federal office or a national legislative issue. We get a lot of questions. We do. I imagine you guys do as well, Gary and Seema, about, does this constitute we have a local referendum on whether or not the subway should be open on Saturdays. Is that just do I have to put that into the issue ads political file, that kind of thing? Or
we do get a lot of questions about whether a particular issue ad
Right,
does communicate or does not communicate a political matter of national importance. And look, there are essentially three categories here, okay? There are issue ads that clearly communicate political matters of national importance. For example, an issue ad that talks about gun control or abortion or something like that. That would constitute a political matter of national importance. Then there are the second category are issue ads that clearly are not communicating political matters of national importance. A matter in a local jurisdiction about whether a bond should be floated for a local gymnasium. Definitely a local matter of importance.
right.
Then there are those. Then there is the third category where it could go either way. And if a station has a rational basis for believing it could go one way or the other, we will defer to the station's good faith interpretation.
That's good to know.
And that will determine whether it gets uploaded or it doesn't get uploaded. And we'll defer if there's a rational basis for that.
But Gary, it's the station's rational basis. You can't rely solely on a campaign telling you or an advertiser telling you, no, we don't think this is a national issue of legislative issue of importance. Is that accurate?
Well, it's the station's interpretation because the station has the obligation to upload or not upload.
Yeah,
Right,
So the
they're on
burden's on the station.
Right.
Yeah,
So-
exactly.
But you're absolutely right. If the issue advertiser advances a very strong argument one way and the station says, you know, I don't agree with that. I think it has to be uploaded. Look, a station never got dinged by the FCC for uploading too much to
Right.
its online political file.
That's right.
So, you know, if there's any question and the station wants to play it very safe, upload it.
Right,
And ostensibly, I've seen in the last couple of weeks, clients ask questions where they say, oh, well, the advertiser checked that this was not a national legislative issue on our form. And then you look at the copy and it's sort of ostensibly a local issue, but they tie in maybe unemployment or gun control or something that is a national legislative issue. So it's not strictly the campaign that gets to make that decision. It's ultimately your obligation as the broadcaster to comply with the rule because the rule applies to you. And
Right.
then what Gary is saying is if you have a reasonable basis for saying, no, that's not a national legislative issue, you'll get a significant degree of latitude if that basis is reasonable. But you can't rely solely on the campaign or the advertiser to tell you, no, this is a local issue.
right,
Right. And if you at the station are not getting the information you need from the sponsor in order to meet your file requirements, and they're insisting that they don't have to provide it because this is not really, you know, an issue ad within our rules. I mean, we can't advise you, yes, no, you know, follow your gut here, but I would talk to your counsel on that and determine, you know, is it worth it to take this ad?
Right.
Or just to avoid the problem?
okay,
Can
We
I
are
just
like-
add one more? Can I
Sure,
just
Gary,
add one
absolutely.
thing about the political file? And we get a lot of questions about this, where a candidate ad or an issue ad that involves a political matter of national importance is broadcast during a network program, and the station broadcasts it.
right,
And the question is the station responsible for uploading information to its political file about that particular ad? And we have answered that question in the affirmative. Yes, stations are obligated to upload records to their online political files about matters that they broadcast, which triggers reporting obligations, regardless of the source of the information.
that's what we've told people as well. No, I agree. Yeah. Because ultimately, it's the licensee's responsibility, right? So they're the ones that are putting this stuff on.
Mhm.
Gary, we have run across situations where a broadcaster has syndicated programming or network programming, and they don't receive the information from the syndicator or from the network within one business day of the programmer accepting that advertising. So what has the FCC said, or is there any informal advice on how stations should deal with that situation?
Yes, there is informal advice, and that is stations should upload as soon as they can the information that they have available to them. It might not be a complete record. They may find out more than a business day later that they broadcast a network advertisement that is reportable. They should note that it was a network feed. They are endeavoring to get the additional information, but as soon as they can, just do the best they can to upload what information they have available to them.
Right. Okay, well, thank you. These are all great bits of advice here on issue ads. We get a lot of questions on those. Just last slide, literally last slide before we're going to go questions. I could see questions popping up on the Q&A, and this is just not required by the FCC, but just sort of a little bit of sort of call it best practices advice that we have been given to our clients, which is that it's maybe a good idea for you to put together like a little cheat sheet, if you will, that has some of the relevant information, your time classes, preemptible time, your lowest unit charge, make good policies, preemptible time, all this bits of relevant information, bearing in mind that this information may change as the political season marches through, so it's not etched in stone. But to have this little bit of information so that you can have it in writing, that you can provide it to the candidates or the agencies that are asking about political time, so that there's no a claim that you didn't properly provide them with information, relevant information regarding to some of these rules and requirements. So this is just sort of again, not required, but just maybe good best practices. You don't have to have them sign a receipt for it or guarantee that they've read it, but at least give them that information so that they have it. So with that is the end of our presentation, but we do have questions. So we do have, by the way, here everyone's contact information, which you can do a screenshot of this if you have any questions that you want to follow up with after the fact. But let's go to the Q&A here, because we've got about 15 minutes left here, and maybe we can sort of go and go through some of these. All right. Well, this is a really interesting question here. So the question is that if a particular candidate's candidacy has been blocked, the example being Colorado's ruling as to the qualifications of Donald Trump to be in their primary, and the candidate asks for for a purchase, what are the station's obligations? Oh, you're muted there, Gary.
I was saying, Seema, do you want to handle that one?
No. I mean, if you have someone who can't be a candidate in that particular state, I think that the station could reasonably say, well, you're not qualified to be a candidate in this state, and we are in this state.
That's what I mean. I would treat it almost kind of like the Lyndon LaRouche situation, where let's put aside the Donald Trump constitutional ruling, but let's just focus on if there's a court ruling that says that a candidate cannot be a candidate in that state, then I think by definition, they're not a candidate. Although in the case of Donald Trump, if he's a candidate in 10 different states, does that come into play?
You know,
I mean,
this-
I still think that a Colorado station would be able to reasonably claim in Colorado, you're not a candidate.
Right, or currently in the state of Maine, right? Because Maine is also
Yeah.
that going on right now. Okay,
You-
good
you-
question.
you know,
Maybe a good time to remind everyone we are off the record, right? So
Right,
these
exactly.
are Seema and Gary's opinions,
Right.
not binding on the FCC.
Okay,
We have not been asked to officially rule
No.
on that.
And
Uh-huh.
this is a unique, novel, situation, which, to my knowledge, has never come up before. So I think the safest thing to say is, we don't know the answer. And we would have to review it very closely if that situation arose. I mean, I think the question is being asked in the abstract right now.
Right.
We have not received any any firm questions about a real situation, and until that comes up, I don't think we have an answer for you.
understood. So
Yeah, I mean,
another question.
it's thoroughly interesting.
Right, it's a great one. No, it's a great question. Great question.
Yeah.
So another one here. Let's see. We may have touched on this already. When should stations upload a political buy? Well, I think we've already said, regardless of whether the buy actually goes through or not. But if they're contacted, they should upload the information within 1 business day. Within 1 business day of when the candidate inquires about his or her intention, correct?
Makes the
Yes,
request.
it's 1 business day from the date that they receive the firm request.
Right.
It's, we get a lot of questions about this station as well. The ads haven't run yet. I don't have to upload them until the ad runs. That's absolutely wrong. They have to upload the information within a business day of receiving the request to buy time. And candidates and issue advertisers, for that matter, will come in and ask to buy time and say, beginning next month, I want to run so many ads.
Right.
So they upload it within a business day of that request, and then it sits there, and so the opposing candidate will know for several weeks in advance that the initial candidate's ads are going to start running. So it's not the date that the ads run, it's the date of the receiving the request that governs here for uploading purposes.
And as just a practical tip, if you're using the NAB PB form, there are several different places for dates on that form, and we advise our clients to make use of those appropriately. It's not unheard of for campaigns at the beginning of the campaign season to sign a request form that they can then send out very quickly to stations that might have an early date for the candidate signature on the form. There's also a place on there where you can put the date where the station receives the request. And we advise clients to make use of that. And when you receive the request, put that date on the NABPB form. So when you upload it to the political file, if the FCC or anybody else is looking, they can see date that it was received, and then look at the political file and see the date, the timestamp for when it was uploaded to the political file. And as long as that's within 1 business day, you'll be in good shape.
I've got another good one here. So this is a lowest unit rate puzzler here. Regarding political digital, does the packaging of digital elements and television spots in a package have any effect on lowest unit rate? And I think we sort of touched on this already, which is basically you have to unpackage the package, correct? I mean, you have to sort of unpackage the package into its elemental spots. So if you are offering sort of a combined discounted rate for everything, then I think the answer is yes, it could impact your lowest unit rate, correct?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
Let's see. A lot about when it comes to for the sake of prudence, is it better, yeah. When it comes to uploading to the public file, I guess for the sake of prudence, is better to be safe than sorry. Absolutely, I think that's true. There was another interesting question here, which was, what is a bona fide interview? And I have an initial answer, which is that I get a lot of questions about a candidate wanting to buy an interview scenario. You know, they're paying to be an interviewee, basically. I would not call that a bona fide interview, correct?
That is absolutely correct.
Exactly, right. So I mean, bona fide is just that, right? That it's legitimately an interview with the candidate on, and that it's not drifting into, you know, some kind of a promotional element, I guess, correct?
Well, it also has to do with editorial control. I mean,
Yes.
let's say a station is interviewing a candidate, and the candidate has provided all the questions that the station should ask him or her. That would raise questions about whether it's a legitimate interview. So there are a number of things that go into determining whether it's bona fide. Certainly, if it's paid for, if the station hasn't received any money at all, that's a paid advertisement. That's clearly not a bona fide news interview program. But you know, the Howard Stern case was a very good example, because the Howard Stern show wasn't determined by the FCC to be a news interview program. Just a segment of his program was determined to be a bona fide interview.
Well, you know, I had an interesting one come up a few years ago, which is that a station wanted to have a candidate for mayor on their morning show, and he was going to be a guest DJ. And they were going to ask him, you know, what's your favorite songs, what's your favorite group, what's your favorite music, but they would also ask him questions about the election. So they were like, well, that's a bona fide interview, isn't it? And you know, I have to be honest with you. I did that. I did that. And I basically told them, you know, I don't know, this sounds a little bit too much kind of like a use to me. You know, and I would be inclined to perhaps err on the side of caution in this one.
That was probably good advice, Frank.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, you know, it's hard to tell sometimes. It really is.
Every candidate is going to, even in a bona fide news interview, will obviously take that opportunity to present themselves in a positive light, but you know,
Here's
there are
another
still to be made.
Another lowest unit rate question here. We're running out of time, so we're down to just a few minutes here. But again, regarding package sales that include multiple radio stations, a client buys 3 stations under one package. How does that affect lowest unit rate?
I think that depends on whether there are some stations that only sell time on their group stations.
Right.
Either you buy on all of them or you buy none of them. If in the situation you're describing, someone has just gotten a volume discount, a package to buy on several stations, but has the discretion to buy on individual stations, then they can break it up and attribute a value. In other words, an opposing candidate who wants to buy time may decide to buy on just one of those stations and not all of them.
But they would get the benefit of the lowest unit rate based on the disaggregation of that package for the advertising time types on that station. So the answer, I think, is that it could lower your lowest unit rate if you're offering multi-station discounts, and somebody comes and says, well, I just want WXYZ, and you've offered a lower rate as part of a package. I think that would be the answer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's
have one here. This is a straightforward one. I think we've touched on. Do we have to upload digital sales? And I guess the answer is no, if it's only just the
Digital only, no.
correct, digital only. That's exactly right. We'll make this the last one. And if a package is an annual commitment, does that exclude it from lowest unit charge inclusion? If a package is an annual commitment, does it exclude it from a lowest unit charge inclusion?
Well, if an annual contract runs during the political season,
Right,
then it would be included
right,
in
exactly.
in the lowest unit charge.
And then you would unpackage it in much the same way that we have been talking about.
Yeah.
If it happens to be happening outside of the 45-60-day window or not the political season, then no, but otherwise, yes.
Yeah, and stations can't manipulate commercial contracts to for the purpose of avoiding the lowest unit charge requirements. We get questions about that from time to time. Stations don't want to charge lowest unit charge, so they structure their commercial contracts in a way to get around that, and that's deceptive.
Okay, well, I think we are out of time. We promised to keep this to 90 minutes. This has been great. I've enjoyed it. Seema and Gary, thank you so much for making available your time to be with us today.
Our pleasure, Frank.
And I also want to thank my partner Seth to be here with us. I want to thank again all the state broadcast associations that are out there to participate. Again, various times during this presentation, we've said if you're uncertain, call your lawyer. Also, if you're uncertain, call your state broadcast association. A lot of those state associations have FCC hotlines that can provide you with information. Take advantage of those things. Good reason to become a member. So with that, we're going to say goodbye and see you next time at the next Fletcher, Hilden, Hildreth webinar. Take care. Bye-bye.